March 1945. The Texas desert. The sound of rain hammering against canvas. The ragged breathing of a woman who believes she is about to die. Inside a small military tent, a young Japanese woman sits pressed into the far corner, her knees drawn up to her chest, her fingers wrapped around a jagged stone. She grips it so tightly that the edges cut into her palm, but she does not feel the pain. Pain is a luxury for those who have time. She does not have time. She has only this moment, this stone, and the silhouette of an American soldier standing at the entrance. She is 23 years old. Her name is Yuki Hayashi, and she has traveled 6,000 miles from Kyoto to die in a place she cannot even pronounce. Everything she was taught about American soldiers is running through her mind like a newsreel of horrors. They are demons. They are monsters. They do unspeakable things to captured women. The man who brought her here told her she would sleep in his tent. She understood those words perfectly. She understood what they meant. But what happens in the next 24 hours will shatter everything she believes. It will break apart a lifetime of propaganda and plant a seed that will grow for 40 years across an ocean. It will prove that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there are moments when ordinary people choose to be extraordinary. This is the story of one night in the Texas desert. One decision, one act of simple decency that echoed through generations. But to understand how Yuki Hayashi ended up in that tent, clutching that stone, preparing to fight for her life, we need to go back 72 hours to a convoy rolling through the dust and heat of the Lone Star State, to a time when she still believed that every American was her enemy. The year is 1945 and the world is burning. In Europe, Allied forces are pushing toward Berlin. In the Pacific, American Marines are dying on islands most people have never heard of. And here in the heart of Texas, a different kind of war is being waged. A quiet war, a war of perception. More than 400,000 prisoners of war are being held on American soil. German soldiers, Italian soldiers, Japanese soldiers. They work on farms picking cotton and herding cattle. They eat American food, sleep in American barracks, and slowly begin to question everything their leaders told them about the enemy. Camp Hearn, located in the rolling plains of central Texas, holds over 4,000 prisoners. It is one of dozens of camps scattered across the state. The prisoners call Texas the land of impossible space because the horizon seems to stretch forever in every direction. For men who grew up in the cramped cities of Europe and Japan, the emptiness is both terrifying and beautiful. But outside the camp fences, the desert holds its own dangers. Rattlesnakes and scorpions, heat that can kill a man in hours, and something worse, something human, deserters. Men who abandoned the American army and now live like bandits in the canyons and arroyos. Men for whom the rules of civilization no longer apply. Men who prey on the vulnerable and leave no witnesses. Into this landscape, a military convoy is carrying 47 Japanese prisoners from the port of Galveston to Camp Hearn. Most are wounded soldiers and medical personnel captured from a hospital ship in the Pacific. Among them are 5 women, all of them nurses, all of them civilians, and one of them is Yuki Hayashi. She sits in the corner of the transport truck, her back against the wooden slats that rattle with every bump in the road. The Texas sun beats down on the canvas cover, turning the interior into an oven. Sweat trickles down her neck, soaking into the collar of her simple cotton uniform. Around her, the other prisoners sit in various states of exhaustion and despair. Some have bandages wrapped around their heads or limbs. Some stare blankly at nothing, their minds still trapped in the horrors they witnessed at sea. The smell of unwashed bodies and old blood hangs in the air like a fog. Yuki does not speak to anyone. She has not spoken more than a few words since she received the letter 8 months ago. The letter that destroyed everything. The woman sitting next to her is named Fumiko. She is 50 years old with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes that have seen too much suffering. She was the head nurse on the hospital ship, and she has taken it upon herself to watch over the younger women. Fumiko leans close and whispers, "They say the Americans treat prisoners well. According to their Geneva Convention, we will have food and shelter and medical care." Yuki does not respond. "But we are women," Fumiko continues, her voice dropping even lower. "The rules are sometimes different for women. We must be careful. We must stay together." Yuki finally turns to look at the older woman. "It does not matter what they do to me." Fumiko's eyes widen with concern. Do not say such things. Your father is waiting for you in Koto. You must survive for him. At the mention of her father, something flickers in Yuki's expression. A crack in the armor she has built around her heart. But it closes just as quickly. My father has already lost everything, she says quietly. He lost my mother when Kenji was born. He lost Kenji to American bombs. What is one more loss? Fumiko reaches out to touch her hand, but the truck hits a pothole and throws them both sideways. By the time they recover, the moment has passed, and Yuki is staring at the canvas wall again, her eyes seeing something far away. She is thinking about Kenji, her little brother, the boy with the quick smile and the clumsy handwriting who used to follow her around the house like a puppy, the boy who was 17 years old when he enlisted in the Imperial Army, the boy who died in a training camp 300 miles from any battlefield, killed by American bombs before he ever learned to fire a rifle. The letter arrived on an autumn morning in 1941. Yuki was thousands of miles away on a hospital ship bandaging wounds and holding the hands of dying men. Her father opened the envelope alone in their house in Kyoto. He read the words alone. He wept alone. By the time Yuki learned of her brother's death, it was already history. Cold, distant, irreversible history. She could not go home for the funeral. She could not hold her father while he cried. She could only stand on the deck of the ship and stare at the endless ocean, thinking about the Americans who had dropped those bombs. From that day forward, every time she saw the American flag, she saw only one thing: the people who killed her brother. And now she is in their country, on their soil, surrounded by their soldiers, breathing their air. She hates them all. 30 miles to the west, in a small outpost on the edge of the desert, a very different kind of person is writing a very different kind of letter. Sergeant Thomas Sullivan sits in his tent with a pencil in his hand and a sheet of paper on his knee. He is 26 years old, with dark hair and brown eyes, and the kind of broad shoulders that come from a childhood of manual labor. His uniform is faded from too many washings, and there is a scar on his left shoulder that aches when the weather changes. He has been writing this letter for an hour, and he has crossed out more words than he has kept. Dear Maria, the letter begins. I know you hate it when I write about the weather, but you have to see the sunsets here. They turn the whole sky red and purple like someone spilled paint across the horizon. I wish you could see it. I wish you could feel the sand between your toes and smell the sagebrush after it rains. He pauses, reading what he has written. Then he crosses out of the last two sentences and starts again. I wish you were here. No, that is wrong. I wish I was there. I wish I was sitting on the porch with you, watching Mama cook Sunday dinner, listening to Papa tell his stories about the old country. He stops writing. The pencil hovers over the paper as memories flood through him. Columbus, Ohio, Little Italy, the narrow streets where everyone knew everyone, where the smell of garlic and tomatoes drifted from every window, where children played stickball in the alleys until their mothers called them home for supper. Giuseppe Sullivan, whose real name was Giuseppe Salvatore, before he changed it to sound more American. A bricklayer with hands like stones and a heart like butter. Rosa Sullivan, who made the best cannoli in the neighborhood and sang old Sicilian songs while she worked. And Maria, his little sister. The girl with the dancing feet and the infectious laugh. The girl who used to chase him through the streets demanding piggyback rides. The girl who could not walk anymore. Thomas closes his eyes and sees the summer of 1935. He is 16 years old, carrying Maria on his back through the crowded streets of Little Italy. She is 12, her arms wrapped around his neck, her legs dangling useless behind her. Faster, Tommy, she shrieks with delight. I want to fly. It is the last summer before the polio took her legs, the last summer before she was confined to a wheelchair, the last summer before Thomas made a promise that would define his entire life. He remembers the night after the diagnosis. Maria lying in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her eyes dry because she had already cried herself out. Thomas sitting beside her, holding her hand, searching for words that did not exist. What am I going to do, Tommy? She whispered. How am I supposed to live like this? And Thomas, 16 years old and terrified and completely certain, said the only thing he could think of. I will be your legs, Maria. I will carry you anywhere you want to go. I will never leave you behind, and I will never let anyone hurt you. I promise. She turned to look at him, and something in her eyes changed. Not hope exactly, something quieter, something like trust. You promise? I promise, and I will make you another promise. I will never abandon anyone who cannot protect themselves, not as long as I live. He kept that promise for 10 years. He carried Maria to school. He carried her to church. He carried her to friends' houses and to the movies and to the park where she liked to feed the pigeons. He built ramps for her wheelchair and fought boys who made fun of her and sat with her on the porch on summer nights, talking about everything and nothing. Then the war came and he had to leave. He opens his eyes and looks down at the letter. The words blur slightly and he blinks hard to clear them. I miss you, Maria. I miss your laugh and your terrible jokes and the way you throw pillows at me when I sing off key. I miss our family. I miss home. He pauses, then adds one more line. I will come back. I promise. He folds the letter and slides it into an envelope. Outside the tent, the sun is beginning to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold. It is beautiful and it is lonely, and it makes him think of all the sunsets Maria will never see. The radio crackles to life, breaking the silence. Outpost 7, this is command. Come in, Outpost 7. Thomas reaches for the handset. This is Outpost 7. Go ahead, command. The voice on the other end is tense. We have a situation. Transport convoy was hit about 20 miles east of your position. Possible deserter ambush. Multiple casualties. Some prisoners unaccounted for. There may be women among the missing. Thomas feels his stomach tighten. He knows about the deserters. He has seen what they do. Understood, command. Do you have coordinates? Sending them now. Be advised the hostiles are armed and dangerous. Do not engage alone. Wait for backup. Copy that. But as he writes down the coordinates, Thomas knows he will not wait for backup. Backup is hours away. And if there are women out there in the desert with those animals, every minute counts. He thinks of Maria. He thinks of his promise. He picks up his rifle and steps out into the dying light. The ambush came without warning. One moment the convoy was rolling through a narrow canyon, the engines grumbling over the rough road. The next moment, the world exploded. The first truck hit a homemade mine buried in the dirt. The explosion lifted the vehicle off the ground and flipped it onto its side, scattering bodies like ragdolls. Before anyone could react, gunfire erupted from the canyon walls above. Yuki was thrown against the side of the truck as it swerved to avoid the burning wreckage ahead. She heard screaming Japanese and English mixed together in a chorus of terror. She heard the sharp crack of rifles and the deeper boom of shotguns. She smelled smoke and blood and burning rubber. Fumiko grabbed her arm and pulled her down to the floor of the truck bed. Stay down, do not move. Through a gap in the canvas, Yuki could see men on the ridgeline above. They were not wearing proper uniforms. Their clothes were a patchwork of military gear and civilian rags. They were laughing as they fired. These were not soldiers. These were something else, something worse. A bullet punched through the canvas and struck the woman on Yuki's other side. She slumped forward without a sound, blood pooling beneath her. We have to run, Fumiko said, her voice surprisingly calm. When I say go, we run. Do you understand? Yuki nodded, too shocked to speak. Go. They scrambled over the tailgate and dropped to the ground. The sand was hot beneath Yuki's hands. Gunfire crackled all around them. She could see American soldiers returning fire from behind the trucks, but they were outnumbered and outpositioned. Fumiko pulled her toward a cluster of boulders on the opposite side of the road. They were almost there when the older woman stumbled. Yuki turned and saw the red stains spreading across Fumiko's chest. No, she whispered. No, no, no. Fumiko fell to her knees, her hand reaching out toward Yuki. Her eyes were already growing dim. Run, she gasped. Run, child. Do not stop. Do not look back. I cannot leave you. You can. You must. Fumiko's voice was fading. Survive. Survive for all of us. Her hand dropped to the sand, her eyes closed. Yuki wanted to stay. She wanted to hold the woman who had been kind to her. She wanted to weep and scream in rage against the unfairness of it all. But Fumiko's last command echoed in her ears. Run. So she ran. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs shook and the sounds of gunfire faded to a distant pop. She ran past rocks and cacti and the bleached bones of animals that had died in this merciless landscape. She ran until the sun set and the stars came out and the temperature plummeted from scorching to freezing. She ran until she could not run anymore. When she finally stopped collapsing behind a massive boulder, she had no idea where she was. The convoy was gone. The other prisoners were gone. Fumiko was gone. She was alone in the Texas desert with no water, no food, and no hope. 2 days passed. 2 days of wandering through a landscape that seemed designed to kill her. The sun rose each morning like a vengeful god, baking the sand until it shimmered with heat. The nights brought cold so intense that she shivered uncontrollably, curling into a ball behind whatever shelter she could find. She learned to find water in the cracks of rocks, tiny pools left over from some ancient rain. She learned to peel the spines from cactus pads and eat the bitter flesh inside. She learned that the desert was not empty, but teeming with life, most of it dangerous. Rattlesnakes sunning themselves on flat rocks, scorpions hiding in the shadows, spiders with legs as long as her fingers. The desert was an ecosystem of predators, and she was the most vulnerable creature in it. At night, she looked up at the stars and thought about her family. Her father sitting alone in the house in Kyoto, surrounded by calligraphy brushes and memories. Did he know she was missing? Did he think she was dead? Or was he still waiting, as he always waited, for news that might never come? Her mother, who died giving birth to Kenji, and whom Yuki had never known. Sometimes she talks to her mother's spirit, whispering into the darkness, asking for guidance. And Kenji, always Kenji, the brother she had promised to protect. The brother who died in fire and thunder while she was half a world away. "I am sorry," she whispered to the stars. "I am sorry I could not save you. I am sorry I could not bring you home." The stars did not answer. They never did. By the third day, Yuki knew she was dying. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her tongue was swollen. Her vision kept blurring at the edges, and sometimes she saw things that were not there. Her mother standing on a distant dune, Kenji waving from behind a rock, Fumiko walking beside her, offering quiet encouragement. She no longer cared about survival. She only wanted the pain to stop. And then she heard the laughter. It was not the laughter of joy. It was the laughter of predators. She turned and saw 3 men emerging from behind a rock formation. They wore the same patchwork of military and civilian clothing she had seen during the ambush. One of them carried a rifle. The other 2 had knives. The man with the rifle had a scar running from his temple to his chin. His smile was the ugliest thing she had ever seen. "Well, well," he said in English, his voice slurred with alcohol. "Look what the desert delivered. A little Japanese doll all alone." Yuki did not understand every word, but she understood enough. She understood the tone. She understood the way they were looking at her. She backed away until she felt the rough surface of a boulder against her spine. There was nowhere else to go. The men spread out, cutting off any escape. They moved slowly, savoring the moment. They had done this before. They were in no hurry. 3 days we have been tracking you," the scarred man said. "Saw the smoke from your little fire at night. Very careless. Very lucky for us." His companions laughed. Yuki reached down and grabbed a sharp stone from the ground. It was a pathetic weapon against 3 armed men, but it was something. It was a choice. If she was going to die, she would die fighting. She would not beg. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. "Come on then," she whispered in Japanese. "Come and see what a daughter of Kyoto can do." The scarred man raised an eyebrow. "She has spirit. I like that." They moved closer. She could smell them now. Sweat and alcohol and something rotten. She raised the stone, her hand trembling. The scarred man raised his rifle. Not to shoot her, just to show her who was in control. And then a sound split the desert air like thunder. A single gunshot, deep and authoritative. The crack of an M1 Garand. The bullet struck the sand at the scarred man's feet, spraying dirt onto his boots. He jumped backward, his smirk vanishing, his eyes darting toward the source of the shot. From behind a low rise, a figure emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the olive drab of the American Army. In his hands was a rifle, the barrel still smoking, the muzzle pointed directly at the 3 men. He did not speak. He did not need to. His eyes said everything. Leave now or die. The scarred man held his gaze for a long moment. Then his eyes flickered to his companions and back to the soldier. He was calculating odds, weighing options. "The girl is not worth it," he finally said. "Let us go." He turned and walked away, his companions following. But before he disappeared over the rise, he looked back one last time. "We will meet again, soldier," he called out. "The desert is big, but not that big." Then they were gone. Yuki stood frozen against the boulder, the stone still clutched in her hand, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She watched the American soldier as he lowered his rifle and turned to face her. He was tall, impossibly tall to her eyes. His face was smudged with dirt and stubble. His uniform was dusty and sweat-stained, but his eyes were calm, steady. They held no malice, no cruelty, no hunger. They held something she did not recognize, something she had not seen in a very long time. He took a step toward her and she flinched, pressing herself harder against the rock. He stopped, raised one hand slowly, palm out, the universal gesture of peace. "Easy," he said quietly. "I am not going to hurt you." She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was the same tone one might use with a frightened animal. But she was not an animal, and she was still terrified. He pointed to himself. "Urakan, soldier." Then he pointed at her. "Japanese poem." He paused, searching for simple words. "You safe with me." She stared at him, her mind racing. This was the enemy. This was one of the people who killed Kenji. This was a demon in human form. But he had just saved her from something worse. He gestured toward the west, where the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Then he pointed at her and at himself and made a walking motion with his fingers. "Come with me," he said slowly. "My camp. Safe." She did not move. He sighed a weary sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. He looked at the sky, judging the light. Then he looked back at her and his expression softened. "I have a tent," he said, speaking slowly and clearly, using his hands to illustrate. He pointed at her, then made a sleeping gesture, tilting his head against his hands. Then he pointed toward his camp again. "You will sleep in my tent." The words hit Yuki like a physical blow. She understood them perfectly. Sleep, tent, his tent. Everything the propaganda had told her came rushing back. Everything Fumiko had warned her about. Everything she had ever heard about what American soldiers did to captured women. This man had not saved her from the bandits. He had saved her for himself. Her blood turned to ice. Her last shred of hope crumbled to dust. But she had no choice. The desert would kill her. The bandits would find her again. This man with his rifle and his calm eyes was her only chance at survival. Even if survival meant enduring whatever horrors he had planned. She would go with him. She would wait for her moment. And if he tried to touch her, she would drive this stone into his eye and take her chances with the desert. She lowered the stone to her side, but she did not let go of it. The American nodded once, then turned and began walking west. After a moment, Yuki followed. They walked in silence as the sun painted the desert gold and crimson. The American led the way, his rifle held loosely but ready. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who knew this land, who had learned its rhythms and its dangers. Yuki walked behind him, watching his every move, watching for any sign of threat, watching for her chance. She did not know that this man had a sister who could not walk. She did not know about the promise he had made in a small bedroom in Ohio 10 years ago. She did not know that he had spent the last 3 months hunting men like the ones he had just driven away, driven by memories of a farmhouse in Mexico where he had arrived too late. She did not know that in a few hours he would do something that would shatter everything she believed about Americans, about enemies, about the capacity of human beings for simple kindness. All she knew was that night was coming, and in the darkness, she would learn the truth. The desert held its breath waiting. They reached the camp as the last light was fading from the sky. It was a simple outpost, nothing more than a small canvas tent pitched beneath an overhang of rock, with a few supply crates stacked nearby and a cold fire pit ringed with stones. The kind of temporary shelter that soldiers build when they expect to move on soon but need somewhere to sleep in the meantime. To Thomas Sullivan it was home, or at least the closest thing to home he had known in months. To Yuki Hayashi it was a trap, a cage, the place where her worst nightmares would finally come true. She stood at the entrance of the tent, her feet rooted to the sand, her fingers still wrapped around the jagged stone she had carried from the canyon. The American soldier gestured for her to enter, his movements calm and unhurried, as if he were inviting a guest into his house rather than a prisoner into her cell. She did not move. He gestured again, more emphatically this time, pointing at the darkening sky and then at the tent. The message was clear. Night is coming. Go inside. Yuki looked at the sky, then at the tent, then at the man. She thought about running. She thought about the desert behind her, cold that was already seeping into her bones. The bandits who were surely still out there somewhere. She thought about Fumiko's last words. Survive. She stepped into the tent. The interior was small, barely large enough for one person and their gear. A bedroll was spread across the ground, a military blanket folded at its foot. A backpack leaned against one wall, bulging with supplies. And everywhere the tools of war, ammunition boxes, a knife in a leather sheath, canteens, a first aid kit, and the rifle. The M1 Garand that had saved her life just hours ago. It rested against the tent pole within easy reach of anyone sitting on the bedroll. Yuki moved to the far corner, as far from the entrance as she could get. She lowered herself to the ground, drew her knees up to her chest, and pressed her back against the canvas wall. The stone was hidden in her palm, its sharp edges a cold comfort against her skin. She would not sleep. She would not close her eyes. She would watch him every second, and the moment he reached for her, she would strike. The American ducked through the entrance, and suddenly the tent felt even smaller. He was so large, this man. His shoulders seemed to fill the entire space. His head nearly brushed the canvas ceiling. When he moved, she could see the muscles shifting beneath his uniform, the easy strength of someone who had spent his life doing physical labor. He could overpower her in an instant. She knew that. But she also knew that surprise was a weapon too, and desperation. He set down his rifle, positioning it carefully against his pack, close to where he would sit, but not in his hands. Then he reached into one of the supply crates and pulled out a small tin. He opened it and held it out toward her. Crackers, some kind of processed cheese, military rations. She shook her head violently, pressing herself harder into the corner. He shrugged and set the tin on the ground between them. Then he took a few crackers for himself and began to eat, his movements casual and unhurried. He did not look at her while he ate. He stared at the tent wall, chewing slowly, his expression distant and thoughtful. Yuki watched him with the intensity of a prey animal watching a predator. Every movement he made, every shift of his weight, every twitch of his fingers sent a jolt of adrenaline through her body. She cataloged everything, the way he held the crackers, the way he brushed crumbs from his uniform, the way his eyes occasionally flickered toward the tent entrance as if he were listening for something outside. When he finished eating, he reached for his rifle. This is it, Yuki thought. Her grip tightened on the stone. This is the moment. But he did not point the rifle at her. He did not even look at her. Instead, he pulled out a small cloth from his pocket and began to wipe down the weapon, slowly, methodically, the way a craftsman might care for a treasured tool. The sound of metal against cloth filled the silence, a soft, rhythmic rasp that seemed to go on forever. Yuki watched his hands move over the rifle, cleaning every surface, checking every mechanism. He was thorough, patient, meticulous. She had seen soldiers clean their weapons before on the hospital ship. It was a ritual, almost a meditation, something they did to calm their minds and steady their nerves. But to Yuki, watching from her corner, with her heart pounding in her throat, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like preparation. The careful, deliberate preparation of a man who was about to do something that required his weapon to be in perfect working order. He is getting ready, she thought, getting ready for what he is going to do to me. And when he is finished, when he has had his way, he will use that rifle to make sure I never tell anyone. She felt tears building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not cry in front of him. She would not give him that satisfaction. If these were her last hours on earth, she would spend them with dignity. Outside, the wind began to pick up. She could hear it whistling through the rocks, carrying the first hints of moisture. A storm was coming. Even the sky was conspiring to trap her here with this man. Thomas finished cleaning the rifle and reassembled it with practiced efficiency. He checked the action twice, the mechanical clicks loud in the confined space. Then he set the weapon across his lap and sat still for a moment, his eyes closed, his lips moving slightly. Is he praying? Yuki wondered. Do monsters pray? When he opened his eyes, he reached for something else, a poncho folded neatly beside his pack. He shook it out and draped it over his shoulders, pulling the hood up over his helmet. Yuki watched confused. Why would he need rain gear inside the tent? Then he did something she did not expect. Something that made no sense at all. He picked up his rifle, rose to his feet, and moved toward the entrance of the tent. He was leaving. He paused at the entrance and turned to look at her. In the dim light, she could barely make out his features, but she could see his eyes. They were not hungry. They were not cruel. They were tired, deeply, profoundly tired. The eyes of a man who had seen too much and carried too heavy a burden. He pointed at her, then at the ground beneath her. Then he made the sleeping gesture again, tilting his head against his hands. "Sleep," he said quietly. "Safe." Then he stepped out of the tent into the gathering storm. Yuki sat frozen, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She could hear him moving around outside, his boots crunching on the sand. Then the sound stopped, and there was only the wind and the first scattered drops of rain beginning to fall. She crawled to the entrance and peered out through a gap in the canvas. He was sitting with his back against a large tree about 10 feet from the tent. His poncho was pulled tight around him, and his rifle rested across his lap. His face was turned toward the desert, scanning the darkness, watching for threats. He was not coming in. He had given her the only shelter he had, and he was staying outside, in the rain, in the cold, with nothing but a thin poncho between him and the elements. He was standing guard, for her. The rain began in earnest, a sudden deluge that hammered the desert with surprising violence. Within seconds, the world outside the tent became a curtain of water. Yuki could barely see the American through the downpour, but she could make out his silhouette still seated against the tree, still facing outward, still watching. She sank back into the tent, her mind reeling. "You will sleep in my tent." The words echoed in her head, taking on new meaning. Not a threat, not a claim of ownership. A promise, a gift. She looked down at the stone in her hand, the weapon she had been clutching for hours, waiting for the moment to strike. Slowly, her fingers uncurled. The stone fell to the ground with a soft thud. She did not understand this man. She did not understand anything anymore. The hours passed like years. Yuki lay on the bedroll, staring at the canvas ceiling, listening to the rain. She could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Fumiko's face, heard the older woman's final words. She saw Kenji's smile frozen forever in her memory. She saw her father's hands steady as they guided a brush across paper, creating beauty from nothing. She wondered if she would ever see those hands again. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, she crawled back to the entrance and looked outside. The American was still there, still sitting against the tree, still watching. The rain had soaked through his poncho, and she could see him shivering. His uniform was plastered to his body, and water dripped from the brim of his helmet. But he had not moved. He had not sought shelter. He had not come in aid. As she watched, she saw his head turn, slowly scanning the perimeter. Then it turned back, always watching, always vigilant. What kind of man does this, she wondered. What kind of enemy sits in the rain all night to protect someone he does not know? She thought about everything she had been taught. The propaganda posters showing American soldiers as demons with fanged teeth and clawed hands. The stories whispered among the nurses about the terrible things that happened to women who were captured. The official pronouncements that Americans were subhuman monsters who deserved no mercy. And then she thought about this man. This specific individual man, who had driven away the bandits without asking for anything in return, who had brought her to shelter and offered her food, who was now sitting in a freezing rainstorm, sacrificing his own comfort to keep her safe. The propaganda said all Americans were the same, all monsters, all demons. But this man was not a monster. This man was something else entirely. For the first time since Kenji died, Yuki felt the ice around her heart begin to crack. She did not forgive the Americans. She could not forgive them for what they had done to her brother. But she could acknowledge in the privacy of her own mind that perhaps not all of them were responsible. Perhaps some of them were just people, ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, trying to do what they believed was right. Perhaps this man was one of them. She lay back down on the bedroll and pulled the blanket over herself. The wool was rough against her skin, but it was warm, and it smelled faintly of coffee and gun oil and something else she could not identify. Something human. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 3 days, she slept. Dawn came slowly to the Texas desert, a gradual lightening of the sky from black to gray to gold. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a world that seemed washed clean, the air fresh and cool, the sand dark with moisture. Thomas Sullivan rose from his position against the tree, every joint in his body screaming in protest. He had not slept. He had not even dozed. 8 hours of vigilance in the cold and rain, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness, his ears straining for any sound that might signal danger. He was exhausted. His uniform was soaked through, and his skin was clammy and cold. His hands were stiff, his fingers barely able to grip the rifle. But he was alive, and more importantly, so was the woman in his tent. He moved slowly toward the tent, his muscles protesting every step. At the entrance, he paused and listened. Soft breathing, the sound of someone sleeping. Good. She needed rest. He turned away and began the morning routine that had kept him alive through months in the desert. First fire. He scraped dry tinder from the inside of a piece of driftwood, shaving away the damp outer layers to reach the dry core. He arranged the shavings in a small pile, shielded from the lingering moisture by a flat rock. Then he struck a waterproof match and coaxed the tiny flame to life, feeding it with progressively larger pieces of wood until he had a small but steady fire. The warmth was exquisite. He held his hands over the flames, feeling the heat seep into his frozen fingers, watching the steam rise from his wet uniform. For a few minutes he simply stood there, letting the fire do its work, letting the chill slowly recede from his bones. Then he filled his canteen cup with water and set it at the edge of the fire to boil. From his pack, he retrieved a small packet of instant coffee and a precious cube of sugar that he had been saving for a special occasion. This seemed special enough. The smell of brewing coffee filled the morning air, rich and dark and impossibly comforting. It was the smell of civilization, the smell of home, the smell of normal mornings and normal times before the world went mad. He heard movement behind him and turned to see the Japanese woman emerging from the tent. She looked better than she had the day before. Still exhausted, still wary, but no longer on the verge of collapse. Sleep had done her good. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes moving from him to the fire to the coffee and back again. She was studying him, he realized, trying to understand what kind of creature he was. He poured the coffee into the metal cup and held it out toward her. She hesitated. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the trap, the trick, the hidden cruelty. Finding none, she slowly reached out and took the cup. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and he saw her flinch slightly, but she did not pull away. She wrapped both hands around the warm metal and raised the cup to her lips. She took a sip, her eyes closed, and then to his surprise, he saw tears begin to slide down her cheeks. She was not crying from sadness. He understood that somehow. She was crying because the coffee was hot and strong and real, and because she was alive to taste it, and because the man who had given it to her had spent the night in the rain to keep her safe. She was crying because the world she had believed in was falling apart, and something new and strange and terrifying was taking its place. Thomas did not know what to do. He had never been good with crying women. Maria cried sometimes, and he would sit beside her and hold her hand and wait for the storm to pass. But this woman was not Maria. This woman was a stranger, an enemy according to the war. So he did the only thing he could think of. He sat down by the fire and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot he had made, and he drank it in silence, giving her space to feel whatever she needed to feel. After a while, her tears stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and took another sip of coffee. When she looked at him again, something had changed in her eyes. The fear was still there, but it was no longer alone. There was something else now. Something that might have been gratitude, or respect, or simply recognition of shared humanity. She pointed at him and spoke a single word, a question. Thomas? She had read his name from the tag on his uniform. He nodded. Thomas, he confirmed. She pointed at herself. Yuki. Yuki, he repeated, trying to get the sounds right. He was pretty sure he mangled it, but she nodded anyway. It was not much. 2 names exchanged over coffee in the desert. But it was something. It was a beginning. They could not stay at the camp. Thomas knew that. The bandits would be back, and this time they might bring friends. The only safe place for Yuki was Camp Hearn, where she could be officially registered as a prisoner of war and given the protection of the Geneva Convention. He explained this to her through gestures and simple words pointing north, miming the shape of buildings and fences, using his hands to indicate many people. She seemed to understand, or at least she did not resist when he began packing up the camp. They set out mid-morning after the sun had dried the worst of the moisture from the desert floor. Thomas led the way, his rifle ready, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead. Yuki followed a few steps behind her footsteps, quiet but steady. The desert after rain was a different world. Flowers had bloomed overnight, tiny splashes of color against the brown and gold of the sand. The air smelled clean and alive, carrying hints of sage and creosote and something sweet that Thomas could not identify. Even the rocks seemed to glow with new intensity, their reds and oranges and yellows almost painfully vivid. It was beautiful, dangerous but beautiful. They walked in silence for the first hour, establishing a rhythm. Thomas would stop occasionally to check the horizon, to listen for sounds that did not belong, to examine tracks in the damp sand. Yuki would stop when he stopped, watching him, learning from him. She was observant, he realized, quick to notice things. When he knelt to examine a set of footprints, she knelt beside him, studying the marks with careful attention. When he pointed out a patch of ground that should be avoided because of the way the sand was disturbed, she nodded and gave it a wide berth. She was adapting, surviving, just like him. It was mid-afternoon when she saved his life. They were crossing a field of scattered boulders, picking their way through the maze of rocks and shadows. Thomas was focused on the path ahead, watching for the easiest route through the obstacles. He did not see the rattlesnake. It was coiled in a patch of shade beneath a large rock, almost invisible against the brown and gray of its surroundings. A western diamondback nearly 5 feet long, its tail already buzzing with that distinctive warning sound that every desert creature learns to fear. Thomas had one foot raised, about to step directly onto the snake's striking zone. Yuki's reaction was instantaneous. She grabbed his arm with both hands and yanked backward with all her strength, pulling him off balance and away from the danger. He stumbled, nearly fell, caught himself on a nearby boulder. The snake struck at empty air, its fangs finding nothing. Then it uncoiled and slithered away into the rocks, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Thomas stood very still for a moment, his heart pounding, his mind slowly catching up with what had just happened. Then he looked at Yuki. She was breathing hard, her hands still outstretched from when she had grabbed him. Her eyes were wide, but not with fear, with something else, something like fierce determination. She had saved his life. The enemy had saved his life. He did not know what to say. In English, he would have said, "Thank you," 1,000 times. But she did not speak English, and he did not speak Japanese, and the words felt inadequate anyway. So he did what felt right. He placed his hand over his heart, bowed his head slightly, and said the only Japanese word he knew. "Arigato." She stared at him. Then slowly a tiny smile flickered across her face. The first smile he had seen from her. "You are welcome," she said in careful, accented English. He blinked in surprise. "You speak English?" She held up her hand, thumb and forefinger almost touching. "Small. Learn in school. Long time ago." It was the longest sentence she had spoken to him. It was also a gift, he realized. She was choosing to bridge the gap between them, choosing to communicate, choosing to trust. "Thank you," he said, "for saving me." She nodded once, then gestured toward the path ahead. They still had a long way to go. Late in the afternoon, Thomas saw the dust cloud on the horizon. He stopped immediately, raising his hand to signal Yuki to do the same. She froze beside him, following his gaze to the distant smudge of brown against the blue sky. 3 figures, moving fast, coming from the east. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He knew who they were. He had known they would come back. Men like Vince did not give up easily. Their pride would not allow it. "Run," he said to Yuki, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward a narrow canyon to the west. "We run now." She did not ask questions. She did not hesitate. She simply ran. They sprinted across the open ground, their feet pounding against the sand, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The canyon mouth loomed ahead, a dark slash in the rock face that promised cover and defensible terrain. Behind them, the dust cloud grew closer. Thomas could hear shouts now, faint but unmistakable. They had been spotted. They reached the canyon and plunged into its shadows. The walls rose on either side, steep and rocky, offering countless places to hide or make a stand. Thomas pulled Yuki behind a large boulder and pressed her down. "Stay here," he said. "Do not move." He checked his rifle, confirmed he had a round in the chamber, and moved to a position where he could see the canyon entrance. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. He had done this before, too many times. The first of the bandits appeared at the canyon mouth. It was Vince, his scarred face twisted with anger, his rifle raised and ready. His two companions flanked him, spreading out to cover more ground. Thomas had the advantage of position and cover, but he was outnumbered 3-1, and if the fight went on too long, they might find a way to flank him. He needed to end this quickly or find another way out. He was calculating angles and odds when a new sound echoed through the canyon, a sound that made everyone freeze. The boom of a Winchester rifle, old and powerful and unmistakable. The shot came from above and behind the bandits. It struck the rock at Vince's feet, sending chips of stone flying, forcing him to dive for cover. "That was a warning," a voice called out, deep and gravelly with the slow drawl of a man who had spent his entire life in Texas. "The next one goes between your eyes." Thomas looked up and saw a figure silhouetted against the sky at the top of the canyon wall. A man on horseback sitting tall in the saddle, a Winchester cradled in his arms. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a star-shaped badge that caught the sunlight. Sheriff Jake McAllister, the law in these parts, and a man who had been hunting deserters for months. "Sullivan," the sheriff called down. "You all right down there?" Thomas stood up from his cover, relief flooding through him. "Yes, sir. I have a civilian with me, Japanese woman from the convoy ambush." "Figured as much. Been tracking these 3 snakes since yesterday." The sheriff's voice turned cold as he addressed the bandits. "Vince, Earl, Buddy, you boys have exactly 10 seconds to drop your weapons and put your hands on your heads. After that, I stop being polite." For a moment, no one moved. Thomas could see Vince calculating, his eyes darting between the sheriff above and Thomas below. 3 against 2, but the 2 had the high ground and better positions. 5 seconds, the sheriff said. Vince's rifle clattered to the ground. His companions followed suit. "Smart choice," the sheriff said. "Now start walking, back the way you came. I will be right behind you." He guided his horse down a narrow trail along the canyon wall, keeping his rifle trained on the bandits the entire time. As he passed Thomas, he nodded. "Get the girl to my place. Ruby will take care of her. I will deal with these 3 and meet you there." "Yes, sir, thank you." The sheriff smiled grimly. "Thank me later. We are not done with this yet." Then he was gone, herding the bandits out of the canyon at gunpoint, leaving Thomas and Yuki alone in the sudden silence. Thomas turned to find Yuki standing behind the boulder, watching him with wide eyes. She had seen everything. The chase, the standoff, the rescue. "Safe now," he said, hoping she understood. "We go to sheriff house. Good people. Food. Rest." She nodded slowly. Then she did something that surprised him. She walked over to where he stood and bowed. A deep, formal bow, the kind he had seen in photographs and newsreels. The bow of respect. The bow of gratitude. The bow of one human being acknowledging another. When she straightened, her eyes were glistening. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thomas?" He did not know what to say, so he simply nodded and gestured toward the canyon mouth. They had a long walk ahead of them, but somehow the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. The sun was setting by the time they reached the McAllister homestead. It was a modest ranch house weathered by years of desert sun and wind, but solid and welcoming. Smoke rose from the chimney and warm light spilled from the windows. A woman appeared on the porch as they approached. She was perhaps 50 years old, with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes, and the sturdy build of someone who had spent her life working hard. She wore an apron dusted with flour, and she wiped her hands on it as she watched them come up the path. "Lord have mercy," she said when she saw Yuki. "Jake radioed ahead and told me you were coming, but I did not expect—" "Well, never mind what I expected. Come inside, both of you. You look like you have been through hell and back." Her name was Ruby McAllister, and she had been married to the sheriff for 30 years. She had raised 4 sons on this ranch, sent 2 of them off to war, and buried 1. She knew about loss, she knew about survival, and she knew about the simple power of a hot meal and a warm bed. She led them into the kitchen, which was filled with the most incredible smells Yuki had ever encountered. Something was sizzling on the stove. Something was baking in the oven. The air was thick with the aroma of butter and meat and spices, a symphony of scents that made her stomach growl audibly. Ruby laughed at the sound. "Sit down, child, both of you. I have been cooking all afternoon." She set plates in front of them, piling them high with food. bacon crispy and golden glistening with fat, eggs fried in butter, the yolks bright orange and perfectly runny, biscuits fresh from the oven, steam rising from their flaky surfaces, and beside each plate, a tall glass filled with dark liquid and ice. Coca-Cola, Ruby said, noticing Yuki's curious look. You ever had it best thing for a hot day or a cold one or any day in between? Yuki had never seen so much food in one place. On the hospital ship, rations had been meager and carefully controlled. In the desert, she had survived on cactus and rainwater. And now here was this woman, this stranger, piling food onto her plate as if she were an honored guest rather than an enemy prisoner. She looked at the bacon, golden brown, crispy at the edges, glistening with rendered fat. She remembered everything she had been taught about Americans. They would poison you. They would trick you. They would make you comfortable before they destroyed you. Then she looked at Ruby McAllister, who was watching her with gentle, patient eyes. And she looked at Thomas, who was already eating his attention, focused on his plate, with the single-minded intensity of a starving man. Yuki picked up a piece of bacon and took a bite. The flavor exploded across her tongue. Salt and smoke and fat and something indefinably, impossibly delicious. It was unlike anything she had ever tasted. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever put in her mouth. She closed her eyes, chewing slowly, savoring every molecule. And then for the second time that day, she began to cry. Ruby moved around the table and put an arm around her shoulders. There now, she said softly. Let it out. You are safe here. Whatever happened out there, it is over now. You are safe. Yuki did not understand all the words, but she understood the tone. She understood the arm around her shoulders, warm and strong and comforting. She understood the food on the plate and the roof over her head and the simple, undemanding kindness of this woman who owed her nothing. She had been living in a lie. Her whole country had been living in a lie. The Americans were not demons. They were not monsters. They were people, complicated, flawed, capable of great cruelty and great kindness, just like everyone else. Just like the people who dropped bombs on training camps, where teenage boys were learning to be soldiers. Just like the man who sat in the rain all night to keep a stranger safe. The world was not simple. Good and evil did not divide neatly along national lines. And sometimes the enemy was not who you expected at all. Yuki ate everything on her plate. She drank the Coca-Cola, which was sweet and strange and wonderful. She accepted a second helping of biscuits slathered with butter that Ruby insisted came from their own cows. And when she finally pushed back from the table, so full she could barely move, she looked at Ruby McAllister and said the only words that seemed adequate. Thank you for everything. Ruby smiled and patted her hand. You are welcome, child. Now let us get you cleaned up and into a proper bed. Tomorrow is another day, and you are going to need your strength. That night, Yuki slept in a real bed for the first time in months. Clean sheets, a soft pillow, a quilt that smelled of lavender and sunshine. She dreamed of Kenji, but for the first time, the dream was not a nightmare. In the dream, he was standing in a garden somewhere surrounded by cherry blossoms smiling at her. Not all of them are the same Ni-chan, he said. The people who killed me and the people who saved you. They wear the same uniform, but they are not the same. How do you know? She asked. Because I can see them now. From where I am, I can see their hearts. And some of their hearts are good. He smiled wider. Your soldier. His heart is good. He is not my soldier. Not yet, Kenji said. But he will be, in a way, for a long time. She woke up with tears on her pillow and sunlight streaming through the window. Somewhere in the house she could smell coffee brewing and bacon frying. She lay there for a long moment staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened. The ambush, the desert, the bandits, the tent, the rain, the man who sat outside all night to keep her safe. She reached under her pillow and felt for the stone she had carried from the canyon, the weapon she had planned to use against him. It was gone. Somewhere along the way she had let it go. She did not need it anymore. The morning Thomas Sullivan took Yuki Hayashi to Camp Hearn, the desert was quiet and still. The violence of the previous days seemed like a distant memory, washed away by the rain and the passage of time. The sky was a perfect blue, unmarked by clouds, stretching endlessly in every direction. They rode in the back of Sheriff McAllister's truck, Ida sitting on opposite sides of the bed, watching the landscape roll past. Ruby had packed them a basket of food for the journey, biscuits wrapped in cloth, a jar of preserves, slices of bacon tucked between pieces of bread, and 2 bottles of Coca-Cola still cold from the icebox. Yuki held the basket in her lap, her fingers tracing the woven pattern of the handle. She had not spoken much since waking, but her silence was different now. It was not the silence of fear or suspicion. It was the silence of someone who was trying to make sense of a world that had turned upside down. Thomas watched her from across the truck bed. In the morning light, she looked younger than her 23 years, fragile almost, but he knew better. He had seen her grab that stone and face down 3 armed men. He had seen her pull him back from a rattlesnake without hesitation. There was steel beneath that delicate exterior. The kind of steel that was forged in fire and loss. He wondered what she was thinking. He wondered if she hated him still. He wondered if she would ever understand that he had only wanted to help. The truck crested a small rise, and suddenly the camp was visible in the distance. A collection of long wooden barracks surrounded by fences, guard towers at regular intervals, the American flag flying from a pole near the main gate. Yuki stared at it, her expression unreadable. This is where she would stay until the war ended. This is where she would be processed and cataloged and assigned a number. She would become a statistic, a prisoner. One of thousands held on American soil waiting for a conflict they had no control over to finally reach its conclusion. But it was also where she would be safe, where she would have food and shelter and medical care, where no one would hunt her through the desert or threaten her with violence, where the rules of civilization, imperfect as they were, would apply. Thomas had done what he could. The rest was out of his hands. The truck stopped at the main gate, and Sheriff McAllister spoke to the guards while Thomas and Yuki climbed down from the back. A young lieutenant appeared, clipboard in hand, his expression a mixture of curiosity and professional detachment. "Sergeant Sullivan, I was told you would be bringing in a survivor from the convoy attack." "Yes, sir. This is Yuki Hayashi, civilian nurse, non-combatant." The lieutenant nodded, making notes on his clipboard. "We will process her and get her settled in the civilian section. There are other Japanese women there. She will not be alone." Thomas turned to Yuki. She was standing very still, her eyes fixed on the camp beyond the gate. He could see her hands trembling slightly at her sides. He wanted to say something. Something that would make this easier. Something that would bridge the impossible gap between them. But what words could possibly be enough? He reached into his pack and pulled out his spare wool blanket. It was Army issue, rough and practical. The kind of blanket that had kept him warm through countless nights in the desert. It was not much, but it was something. He held it out to her. "Here," he said, "for the cold nights. Camp can get cold." She looked at the blanket, then at him. Her eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. She took the blanket and held it against her chest, her fingers clutching the rough wool as if it were made of gold. Then she did something that made every soldier in the vicinity stop and stare. She bowed. Not a quick nod of acknowledgement. A full formal bow, the kind that in Japanese culture was reserved for moments of profound respect and gratitude. The kind that said more than any words could express. She held the bow for a long moment, her body bent at the waist, her head lowered. The silence stretched out, broken only by the wind and the distant sounds of the camp. When she straightened, there were tears running down her cheeks. "Thomas," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Arigatou gozaimasu." He did not know exactly what the words meant, but he understood their weight. He understood that she was thanking him for more than just a blanket. She was thanking him for her life, for the tent and the rain and the coffee in the morning, for showing her that not all enemies were monsters. He placed his hand over his heart and nodded. It was the only response he could think of. Then the lieutenant stepped forward to lead her away, and Thomas watched her go. Her small figure grew smaller and smaller as she walked toward the gate, the wool blanket clutched in her arms, until finally she disappeared behind the fence. He stood there for a long time, staring at the place where she had been. Then he climbed back into the truck, and Sheriff McAllister drove him back to his post, and the war continued as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, something that would echo across decades and oceans and generations. Thomas Sullivan just did not know it yet. Camp Hearn was not what Yuki expected. She had prepared herself for brutality, for starvation and beatings and the systematic cruelty that the propaganda had promised. She had prepared herself to suffer, to endure, to survive through sheer force of will. Instead, she found something that shook her more deeply than any violence could have. She found humanity. The barracks were simple but clean. Each prisoner had a bed with sheets and a pillow. There was running water and electricity, and a mess hall that served 3 meals a day. The food was not Japanese, but it was plentiful and nourishing. Rice and vegetables and meat and bread and butter. The guards were strict but professional. They enforced the rules without cruelty. They did not beat the prisoners or humiliate them or treat them like animals. When a prisoner was sick, they sent doctors. When a prisoner had a complaint, they listened. It was not freedom, but it was not hell either. Yuki shared a barracks with 12 other Japanese women, all of them civilians captured from various ships and outposts across the Pacific. They came from different backgrounds in different regions, but they had all been taught the same things about Americans. They had all expected the worst, and they had all been wrong. In the evenings, they would gather in the common area and talk about their experiences, the things they had seen, the kindnesses they had received, the slow, painful process of rebuilding their understanding of the world. One woman, a teacher from Osaka, had been given English lessons by a young guard who wanted to practice his Japanese fume. Another, a secretary from Tokyo, had been treated for a serious infection by an American doctor who had stayed by her bedside for 3 days. A third, a mother of 2 from Nagasaki, had received letters from her children through the Red Cross delivered by camp administrators who could have easily thrown them away. These were not the actions of demons. These were the actions of people. Complicated, imperfect, sometimes wonderful people. Yuki listened to these stories and thought about Thomas Sullivan, about the night he spent in the rain, about the coffee he made her in the morning, about the blanket she still clutched every night as she fell asleep. She had hated all Americans. She had blamed them all for Kenji's death. But hatred, she was learning, was a blunt instrument. It could not distinguish between the pilot who dropped the bomb and the soldier who sat in the rain. It could not see the individual for the uniform, and individuals mattered. She knew that now. One night, about a month after her arrival, Yuki sat on her bed and unfolded the wool blanket. She pressed it to her face and breathed in its scent, dust and wool and something faintly human. The smell of the man who had given it to her. She made a decision. Somehow, someday, she would find him. She would thank him properly. She would tell him what his kindness had meant to her. She did not know how, she did not know when, but she would do it. It was a promise she made to herself in the quiet of that barracks, surrounded by sleeping women with the Texas stars shining through the window. A promise she would keep. The war ended in August of 1945. The news came over the camp loudspeakers on a hot summer afternoon. Japan had surrendered. The fighting was over. The world could begin to heal. Yuki stood in the yard with the other prisoners, listening to the announcement, trying to process what it meant. She was going home. After everything she had been through, she was going home. But home was not the same place she had left. Kenji was still dead. Her father was still alone. And she was not the same person who had boarded that hospital ship so many months ago. She had been changed. By the desert, by the camp, by a man whose language she barely spoke but whose actions she would never forget. The repatriation process took months. Paperwork and processing and the slow logistics of moving thousands of people across an ocean. Yuki spent the time saying goodbye to the women who had become her family, promising to write, promising to remember. And she spent it thinking about the future, about what she would do when she returned to Kyoto, about how she would explain to her father the things she had learned, about whether she would ever see Thomas Sullivan again. In December of 1945, Yuki Hayashi boarded a ship bound for Japan. She carried almost nothing with her: a small bag of clothes, a few photographs, and a wool blanket that she had refused to leave behind. She stood on the deck as the ship pulled away from the California coast, watching America grow smaller and smaller on the horizon, the land of her enemies, the land of her saviors, the land where she had learned that nothing was as simple as she had believed. "Thank you," she whispered to the distant shore, "for everything." Then she turned and faced east toward home, toward the next chapter of her life. But she was not finished with America. Not yet. The letter arrived in Columbus, Ohio in the spring of 1947. Thomas Sullivan was sitting at the kitchen table when his mother brought in the mail. There were bills and advertisements and a letter from his aunt in New York. And there was one envelope that looked different from the rest. It was covered in foreign stamps. The handwriting on the front was small and precise, clearly the work of someone for whom English was not a native language. The return address was in Kyoto, Japan. Thomas stared at the envelope for a long moment. His heart was beating faster than it had any right to. He opened it carefully as if it contained something fragile and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. To the kind soldier in the rain, the letter began. I am Yuki Hayashi. Perhaps you do not remember me, but I remember you. I will always remember you. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. He did remember her. He had thought about her often in the 2 years since the war ended, wondering what had become of her, whether she had made it home safely, whether she ever thought about those strange days in the Texas desert. Now he had his answer. He read on. That night, when you sat in the rain, you taught me something that no school could teach. You taught me that enemy is just a word, that the people who wear the same uniform are not all the same, that kindness does not ask about nationality. I hated all Americans before I met you. I blamed you all for my brother's death. But you showed me that I was wrong, not about the war, not about the bombs, but about the people. I still have the blanket you gave me. It keeps me warm every night. When I hold it, I remember the coffee you made me. I remember the way you said my name. I remember that there was one American who was not my enemy. Thank you, Thomas Sullivan, for the tent, for the rain, for everything. Yuki Hayashi, Kyoto, Japan. Thomas read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket close to his heart. Maria wheeled herself into the kitchen, her eyes bright with curiosity. What was in the letter, Tommy? You look like you have seen a ghost. Thomas smiled. Not a ghost, a friend. From the war. A friend, Maria's eyebrows rose. You never told me about any friends from the war. I'm telling you now. He told her the whole story, the convoy ambush, the desert, the bandits, the tent, the night in the rain, the blanket, everything. When he finished, Maria was crying. You have to write her back, she said. You have to tell her you remember. I know. Promise me, Tommy. Promise me you will write to her. Thomas looked at his sister, at the tears on her cheeks, at the fierce determination in her eyes. She understood, he realized. She understood what it meant to be helpless and afraid, and to have someone choose kindness instead of cruelty. I promise, he said, and he did. His reply was shorter than her letter, but no less heartfelt. Dear Yuki, of course I remember you. I could never forget. I did not do anything special that night. I only did what my mother taught me, what my father taught me, what my sister taught me. You protect the people who cannot protect themselves. You share what you have. You treat others the way you want to be treated. I am glad you kept the blanket. It was my favorite one, but it looks better on you. I am glad you made it home safe. I thought about you often. I wondered if you were okay. Now I know. The war is over. We are not enemies anymore. We are just 2 people who shared something strange and difficult and maybe a little bit beautiful. I would like to keep sharing. If you want to write again, I would like that very much. Your friend, Thomas Sullivan, Columbus, Ohio. The letter took 3 weeks to reach Kyoto. Yuki was sitting in her father's house practicing calligraphy when it arrived. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope. She read his words once, then again, then a 3rd time until she had memorized every line. Your friend. He had called her his friend. She smiled, the first real smile she had worn in a very long time. Then she picked up her brush and began to write her reply. The letters continued for 40 years. They wrote about everything and nothing, about their families and their towns and the small details of daily life, about the weather and the seasons and the way the world kept changing around them, about memories and hopes and fears and dreams. In 1952, Yuki wrote to tell Thomas she was getting married. His name was Hiroshi, and he was a teacher, and he was kind and patient and good. She had told him about Thomas, about the desert, about the night in the rain. Hiroshi said he wanted to meet the Americans someday. He wanted to thank him for saving his future wife. Thomas wrote back with congratulations and a small gift, a silver pen, the kind that Japanese calligraphers used. He had spent 3 months searching for exactly the right one. In 1955, Thomas wrote to tell Yuki he had a son. His name was Michael, and he had his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn streak. Thomas said he would tell Michael about Yuki someday when the boy was old enough to understand. He would tell him about the war and the desert and the woman who taught him that courage was not about fighting but about trusting. Yuki wrote back with her own congratulations and a small gift. A origami crane folded from paper she had made herself. In Japan, she explained cranes were symbols of peace and longevity. She hoped Michael would have both. In 1960, Thomas wrote the hardest letter of his life. Maria had died, the sister he had carried on his back through the streets of Little Italy, the girl who had made him promise to protect the helpless. She had fought her illness for 25 years, and finally her body had given out. She read all your letters, Thomas wrote. Every single one. She said you were brave. She said you reminded her of herself. Two women who refused to let circumstance define them. Yuki wept when she read those words. She had never met Maria Sullivan, but she felt like she had lost a sister. She wrote back with her condolences in a poem, a traditional Japanese verse about cherry blossoms falling in spring. Beautiful and brief and heartbreaking, like all the best lives. In 1975, Yuki wrote to share joyful news. She was a grandmother. Her daughter Hanako had given birth to a baby girl. They had named her Kenji after Yuki's brother who had died so long ago. In Japan, Yuki explained, "We believe that souls return to us, that the people we love never truly leave. Kenji is gone, but now there is a new Kenji, a little girl who will carry his name into the future." Thomas wrote back that he understood. He had named his own son after his father Giuseppe, though they called him Michael, because it was easier to pronounce. "The names we give our children are prayers," he said. Prayers for the future. Prayers for remembrance. Prayers for hope. In 1985, they were both old. Thomas was 66, his hair white, his body slower than it used to be. Yuki was 63, her face lined with the years, but her eyes still sharp and bright. Thomas wrote, "I think about you more now than I used to." Maybe that is what happens when you get old. You start looking backward instead of forward. I look back at that night in the desert, and it still feels like yesterday. I can still smell the rain. I can still hear your breathing in the tent. I can still feel the cold seeping into my bones while I sat against that tree. Yuki wrote, "I think about you too. I think about the coffee you made me. I think about the way you said my name so carefully like you were afraid of breaking it. I think about how I hated all Americans, and then I met one who changed everything." She paused, her brush hovering over the paper. Then she added one more line. "I never told you this, but I had a stone in my hand that night. A sharp stone. I was going to use it on you if you tried to hurt me. I was ready to kill you or die trying." She had never admitted this before, not in 40 years of letters, but they were old now, and some truths could finally be spoken. Thomas read her confession and laughed out loud. Then he wrote back, "I know, I saw it. You were holding it like you meant business. That is why I went outside. I figured if I was in the tent, you would never sleep. And you needed sleep more than I needed to be dry." Yuki stared at his words for a long time. He had known, and all along he had known she was ready to attack him, and he had gone out into the rain anyway. She picked up her brush and wrote 2 words in Japanese characters at the bottom of her next letter. "My hero." It was the last letter Thomas Sullivan would ever read. He died on March 15, 1987. A heart attack sudden and swift. He was 68 years old. His son Michael found the letters in a drawer in his father's desk. Hundreds of them, spanning 4 decades, carefully arranged in chronological order, tied together with a piece of string, kept like treasures. Michael read through them all. It took him 3 days. By the time he finished, he understood something about his father that he had never fully grasped before. Thomas Sullivan had been a quiet man. He rarely talked about the war. He rarely talked about himself. He did his job, raised his family, lived his life. An ordinary man by most measures. But he had done something extraordinary once, something that mattered, something that had rippled across 40 years and touched lives on the other side of the world. Michael knew what he had to do. He sat down and wrote a letter to Kyoto. "Dear Mrs. Yuki Hayashi, my name is Michael Sullivan. I am the son of Thomas Sullivan. I am writing to tell you that my father passed away on March 15th of this year. In his final hours, he spoke of you often. He asked me to write to you. He asked me to tell you that he never regretted that night in the desert, not for a single moment. I found your letters in his desk, all of them. 40 years of correspondence kept like precious things. I read every one. I know the story now. The convoy, the bandits, the tent, the rain. My father was not a man who talked much about his feelings. But those letters told me everything I needed to know. You were important to him. Your friendship meant more than I can say. He kept the origami crane you sent when I was born. It sat on his desk for 32 years. Every time I asked about it, he would smile and say it was from a friend. Now I understand. I hope this letter finds you well. I hope the years have been kind to you. And I hope you know that across the ocean, in a small house in Ohio, a man spent 40 years grateful for one night in the rain. With deepest respect, Michael Sullivan. Yuki was 83 years old when the letter arrived. She was sitting in her garden in Kyoto, wrapped in a blanket against the spring chill. The same wool blanket Thomas had given her 42 years ago. Faded now, worn thin in places, but still warm, still carrying the faint scent of the desert. Hanako brought her the letter. Yuki's daughter was 55 now, her hair streaked with gray, her face marked by time. She had heard the story of the American soldier many times. She knew what this letter would contain. Yuki opened the envelope with trembling fingers. She read Michael's words slowly, her lips moving silently, her eyes growing wet. When she finished, she pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. Thomas was gone. The man who had sat in the rain for her. The man who had made her coffee and given her his blanket and called her his friend. The man who had shown her that enemies were just people wearing different clothes. Gone, but not forgotten. Never forgotten. She sat in her garden for a long time, holding the letter, thinking about everything that had happened. The war, the desert, the camp, the years, the letters, the friendship that had grown across an ocean nourished by ink and paper, and the simple act of remembering. Then she called for Hanako. I need you to help me write a letter, she said, and then I need you to do something for me, something important. Hanako knelt beside her mother. Anything. Yuki looked at her daughter with clear, determined eyes. I want you to go to America. I want you to find Thomas's son, and I want you to invite him here, to Kyoto, to this house. But mother, why? Yuki smiled. It was a sad smile, but also peaceful. The smile of someone who has made peace with the past. Because some stories are not finished until you meet face to face. Because I am too old to travel, but he is not. And because there is something I need to give him. Something his father would have wanted him to have. Hanako looked at the wool blanket wrapped around her mother's shoulders. She understood. I will find him, she said, I promise. The meeting happened in 2005. Michael Sullivan was 50 years old when he finally traveled to Kyoto. He carried with him a small wooden box. Inside the box was a portion of his father's ashes, and carefully folded the wool army blanket that Thomas had given to Yuki so many years ago. The blanket had come back to America in 1987, sent by Yuki after she received news of Thomas's death. She had kept it for 42 years, and now she wanted it returned to his family. But she had included a note asking if someday someone might bring it back to her. Just once, just so she could see it again. Michael had promised himself he would fulfill that request. It had taken 18 years, but he was finally here. Hanako met him at Narita Airport in Tokyo. She was 55 years old, her English accented but fluent, her manner warm and welcoming. They recognized each other immediately, though they had never met. The photographs they had exchanged over the years had prepared them for this moment. Michael-san, Hanako said, bowing slightly. Hanako. Michael replied, bowing in return. He had practiced the gesture on the plane. They stood there for a moment, two strangers connected by a story that had begun before either of them was born. Then Hanako smiled. My mother is waiting. She has been counting the days. They took the bullet train to Kyoto. Michael watched the Japanese countryside flash past the window, thinking about his father. Thomas had never visited Japan. He had never seen the country whose language he could not speak, but whose people had given him his most unlikely friend. I am seeing it for you, Dad, Michael thought. I am finishing what you started. The house in Kyoto was small and traditional, with sliding paper doors and a garden filled with carefully tended plants. It looked like something from another century, a piece of old Japan preserved amid the modern city. Hanako led him through the gate and into the garden, where an old woman sat in a chair beneath a cherry tree. She was wrapped in a shawl, her white hair pulled back from her face, her eyes bright and alert despite her 83 years. Yuki Hayashi. Michael approached slowly, the wooden box held in both hands. He stopped a few feet away and bowed deeply the way his father had described in one of his letters. The bow of respect, the bow of gratitude. Mrs. Hayashi, he said, I am Michael Sullivan, Thomas's son. Yuki looked up at him, her eyes moving across his face, searching for traces of the man she had known. You have his eyes, she said softly. The same eyes. Kinpan. Michael felt tears prick at his own eyes. Thank you, that means more than I can say. He knelt beside her chair and opened the wooden box. Inside, nestled against dark velvet, was a small urn and the folded wool blanket. I brought him to you, Michael said. A part of him anyway. He would have wanted to be here. He would have wanted to see you one more time. Yuki reached out with trembling fingers and touched the urn. Then she touched the blanket, her hand lingering on the rough wool. I kept this for 42 years, she whispered. Every night I slept with it. Every night I remembered. I know. He knew too. He read every letter you sent. He kept them all. Did he tell you the story? The whole story? He told me some of it. Your letters told me the rest. Yuki nodded slowly. Then she looked up at Michael with those bright, clear eyes. Your father saved my life. Not just from the bandits, from myself, from my hatred. I was so full of anger when I met him. I blamed all Americans for my brother's death. I thought you were all monsters. She paused, her voice growing stronger. But Thomas showed me the truth. He showed me that one person can represent something larger. One act of kindness can heal 1,000 wounds. One night in the rain can change a lifetime of believing. She reached out and took Michael's hand. I want you to know something. I want you to tell your children and their children for as long as your family remembers. Thomas Sullivan was a good man, not because of what country he came from, not because of what uniform he wore, because of what was in his heart. Michael squeezed her hand gently. I know, I always knew, but I understand it better now. They sat together in the garden as the afternoon light faded. Hanako brought tea and they drank it in comfortable silence, watching the cherry blossoms drift down from the trees. Later, as the sun began to set, Yuki asked Michael to scatter some of his father's ashes in her garden. Let him stay here, she said. Let a part of him rest in Japan. He was a bridge between our countries. Let him be that bridge forever. Michael did as she asked. He walked to a quiet corner of the garden near a stone lantern that Yuki said had belonged to her father, and he scattered a handful of ashes among the flowers. Rest easy, Dad, he whispered. You finally made it to Japan. That night it rained, a soft spring rain, gentle and warm, the kind of rain that nourishes rather than destroys, the kind of rain that washes the world clean and gives everything a fresh start. Yuki sat by the window in her bedroom, watching the rain fall on her garden. The wool blanket was draped across her shoulders again, returned to her at last. In her lap was the small urn containing what remained of Thomas Sullivan's ashes. She was thinking about the night in the desert, the tent, the fear, the stone in her hand, and the American soldier who had walked out into the storm to keep her safe. You will sleep in my tent. Not a threat, never a threat, a promise, a gift, an act of grace that had echoed across 60 years and changed 2 lives forever. She closed her eyes and listened to the rain. In her mind, she was 23 again, huddled in a corner of a canvas tent, watching through a gap in the fabric as a man sat in the downpour with a rifle across his lap, watching as he shivered in the cold, watching as he refused to come inside. She had not understood then. She had been too afraid, too full of hate, too convinced that all Americans were enemies. But she understood now. She had spent 40 years understanding through letters and memories and the slow work of healing. Thomas Sullivan had taught her the most important lesson of her life, that people are not their countries, that individuals cannot be blamed for the actions of armies, that kindness requires courage, and courage can be as simple as giving up your shelter for someone who needs it more. She opened her eyes and looked at the urn in her lap. Thank you, Thomas, she said quietly, for the tent, for the rain, for teaching me how to forgive. She paused and a small smile crossed her weathered face. I kept my promise. I found you. I thanked you. And now finally we are in the same place at the same time. It only took 60 years. She laughed softly at her own joke. Then she lifted the urn and pressed her lips to its cool surface. Good night, my friend. Sleep well. Outside, the rain continued to fall soft and steady, like a blessing from the sky. Yuki Hayashi died 6 months later peacefully in her sleep. She was 84 years old. They found her in her bed, the wool blanket pulled up to her chin, the small urn clutched in her hands. On her face was an expression of perfect peace, the expression of someone who had finished everything they needed to do. Hanako honored her mother's final wish. She scattered Yuki's ashes in the same garden where Michael had scattered Thomas's. The two friends, separated by war and ocean and culture, were finally together. The cherry tree bloomed that spring more beautifully than it ever had before, and the story passed into family legend. Hanako told it to her children, who told it to their children. Michael told it to his children, who told it to their children. Across the Pacific, in two countries that had once been enemies, families gathered and remembered. They remembered a convoy ambush in the Texas desert. They remembered a young woman with a stone in her hand and fear in her heart. They remembered a soldier who made a choice that mattered. They remembered that history is not only made by generals and presidents. It is made by ordinary people in ordinary moments, choosing kindness over cruelty, trust over fear, humanity over hatred. They remembered 5 words spoken in broken English on a dusty desert evening. You will sleep in my tent. Not a threat, a promise, a light in the darkness, a bridge across the impossible. And they remembered the lesson that Yuki Hayashi spent 40 years trying to explain in letter after letter to anyone who would listen. That enemies are just people we have not met yet. That war cannot destroy the human capacity for grace. That one act of simple decency offered without expectation of reward can ripple across generations and change the world. This is the story of Thomas Sullivan and Yuki Hayashi, a soldier and a nurse, an American and a Japanese. 2 people who should have been enemies but became something more. 2 people who proved that even in the darkest times, the light finds a way through. The end.